When the Terrans first emerged from their blue-green world in what they called the Sol system, the Galactic Council welcomed them with the standard protocols reserved for newly spacefaring civilizations. Their ships were crewed by galactic standards, chemical rockets strapped together with what appeared to be desperation and audacity in equal measure. Their first ambassadors arrived at the neutral station of Kepler's Rest wearing simple cloth garments, speaking in measured tones about peace, cooperation, and mutual understanding. The Zephyrian representative, Ambassador Vexthala, would later record in his personal files that the humans seemed refreshingly naive compared to the typical aggressive expansionist species that occasionally clawed their way off their homeworlds. The humans spoke of trade agreements, cultural exchange, and scientific cooperation. They brought gifts, music, art, literature, rather than weapons demonstrations or territorial claims. For 3 standard cycles, this perception held. Human diplomats established embassies on 17 different worlds. They negotiated mining rights in the Outer Rim with remarkable fairness, often accepting terms that other species would have rejected as insulting. They mediated disputes between the crystalline hegemony and the mollusk confederation, with a patience that impressed even the ancient ethereals, who had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead human xenopsychologist, became something of a celebrity in academic circles. Her papers on interspecies emotional recognition patterns and the universal nature of humor were required reading at institutions across the galaxy. She spoke at conferences with an earnestness that charmed even the most cynical observers. When asked about humanity's approach to galactic politics, she would smile and say, "We've learned that listening is more powerful than shouting." The first hint that something was amiss came during the Andromeda's border incident. The Skari hive mind had been expanding aggressively into contested space, their bioships consuming asteroid belts and minor planets to fuel their growth. 17 species had filed formal complaints with the Galactic Council, but the bureaucratic machinery ground slowly, as it always did. The humans offered to facilitate discussions between the Skari and the affected worlds. Ambassador Chen Wei-Lin, a soft-spoken man who collected antique tea sets, volunteered to serve as mediator. The negotiations were held aboard a neutral vessel in the DMZ, with representatives from all interested parties. What happened next was reconstructed from sensor logs and survivor testimony, as the official records were somehow corrupted during transmission. According to Lieutenant Vashtar of the Regalian Navy, who was present as an observer, the negotiations proceeded normally for the first 6 hours. The humans presented frameworks for resource sharing, population distribution models, and economic incentives for voluntary relocation. The Skari Queen voice, speaking for the collective consciousness of 18 billion individuals, rejected every proposal with barely concealed contempt. "Your soft words mean nothing, mammal," she had said, her translator rendering the chemical signals into standard galactic. "We take what we need. This is the way of strength." Ambassador Chen had nodded politely, making notes on his primitive paper pad. "I understand your position," he had said. "Perhaps we could explore alternative approaches." What Lieutenant Vashtar described next defied conventional understanding of human behavior. Chen had excused himself briefly, ostensibly to consult with his team. When he returned, something had changed. Not in his appearance. He still wore the same plain suit, still spoke in the same measured tones. But Lieutenant Vashtar, whose species could perceive electromagnetic fluctuations, reported that the human's bioelectric field had shifted dramatically. "The negotiation will now proceed under modified parameters," Chen had announced, his voice carrying an undertone that made every non-human in the room unconsciously shift away from him. He had placed a small device on the table. Later analysis would reveal it to be a simple holographic projector, crude by galactic standards. The hologram that materialized was a tactical display of the Skari fleet positions, not approximate positions based on publicly available data, but precise real-time locations down to the individual bioship. Fuel levels, crew complements, weapon charges, structural weak points, everything was laid out in clinical detail. "These are your current assets in the disputed zone," Chen had continued, his finger tracing through the projection. "Impressive numbers. However, I noticed some concerning vulnerabilities in your formation pattern." The Queen voice's chemical emission shifted to what the translator registered as alarm/confusion. "How do you possess this information?" "Our fleet movements were classified," Chen had interrupted gently. "Past tense is important here." He had gestured, and the display shifted to show human ship positions. They had been there all along, cloaked or disguised, positioned at every strategic choke point and supply line the Skari had established. We took the liberty of conducting our own survey of the region. The room had fallen silent, except for the various atmospheric recycling systems and the faint humming of the Queen Voice's respiratory apparatus. Lieutenant Vashtar would later describe the sensation as being trapped in a cage with a predator that had stopped pretending to be tame. Chen had continued his presentation with the same academic calm Dr. Vasquez displayed at her conferences. Your bioships derive nutrition from processed asteroid material, correct? Fascinating adaptation. We've been studying your metabolic requirements. Another gesture, and the display showed mineral composition analyses. Selenium deficiency becomes critical after approximately 47 standard days without resupply. Here, a red indicator pulsed on the hologram. As they watched, it flickered and disappeared. Was here, Chen had corrected. Our apologies for the temporal confusion. The Queen Voice's chemical emissions spiked into what Lieutenant Vashtar's translator could only render as pure terror. The collective consciousness was evidently in communication with the fleet, receiving real-time reports of supply caches simply vanishing, not destroyed. That would have left debris. Simply gone, as if they had never existed. This is an act of war, the Queen Voice had shrieked, the translator struggling with the complex chemical symphony of rage and fear. Chen had looked genuinely puzzled. War? I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. This is still a negotiation. We're simply adjusting the parameters to reflect reality rather than posturing. He had smiled, the expression somehow more unsettling than any threat. You see, we found that meaningful dialogue requires all parties to understand their actual position, not their imagined one. The final element of Chen's presentation had been a series of what he called educational scenarios. Each one showed a different potential outcome of continued Skari expansion, calculated with mathematical precision that would have impressed the machine intelligences of the synthetic collective. In every scenario where the hive mind rejected the proposed agreements, their civilization suffered catastrophic collapse within 2 standard cycles. These projections assume, of course, that we continue our current policy of non-interference, Chen had noted. Should circumstances change, the timeline could accelerate considerably. Lieutenant Vashtar's report included detailed biometric readings from all attendees during this presentation. The humans in the room, Chen's 3 assistants, showed no elevation in stress hormones, no increase in neural activity, no signs of deception or uncertainty. They were, by every measurable standard, completely relaxed. The non-humans, conversely, displayed stress responses that pushed several species close to medical emergency thresholds. The Skari Queen Voice had agreed to all human proposals within the next hour. When news of the successful negotiation reached the Galactic Council, it was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy. The humans had achieved in one day what traditional methods had failed to accomplish in 3 cycles. Ambassador Chen was commended for his innovative approach and invited to lecture at the prestigious Centauri Institute for Conflict Resolution. But those who had been in that room carried with them a growing suspicion that something fundamental about humanity had been misunderstood. Lieutenant Vashtar's classified report disappeared from official records. Another transmission error, but copies found their way to intelligence agencies across the galaxy. The investigation that followed would reveal the scope of human deception and force a complete reassessment of the species the galaxy had welcomed as peaceful newcomers. Dr. Kethvar of the Centauri Intelligence Service would later write, "We had been watching children play with toys, not realizing they were generals planning campaigns. The humans had not been learning our ways. They had been mapping our weaknesses. The border incident had been a demonstration, not a negotiation. Humanity had been studying galactic civilization for 3 cycles, cataloging military capabilities, economic dependencies, and psychological profiles of every major species. What they presented as diplomatic solutions were actually carefully calculated displays of overwhelming intelligence superiority, designed to achieve compliance without the inefficiency of actual warfare. But this was only the beginning. The Skari incident had revealed the presence of human assets throughout the galaxy, assets that officially did not exist, ships that appeared on no registry, personnel with no documented training, technologies that human science supposedly could not produce. The peaceful traders and cultural attachés had been cover for the largest intelligence operation in galactic history. As one ethereal observer noted in his encrypted personal log, We believed we were teaching infants to walk among giants. Instead, we had invited apex predators into our nursery and shown them where we kept our young. Part 2. The Architecture of Predation. The revelation that humanity had been conducting a covert intelligence operation since first contact prompted an emergency session of the Galactic Security Consortium. Representatives from 47 species gathered in the secured chambers of Deep Station Alpha, a facility supposedly impervious to surveillance. The irony of this location choice would become apparent only later, when it was discovered that humans had been monitoring these secure communications from the moment the station became operational. Sithik, the consortium's leading expert on predator species evolution, presented the initial assessment. His analysis began with what seemed like an academic exercise, comparing humanity's claimed evolutionary history with observed behavioral patterns. The discrepancies once identified painted a picture that transformed everything the galaxy thought it knew about Earth's dominant species. Ladies, gentlemen, and collective consciousness entities, Dr. Sithek had begun, his forearms manipulating holographic displays while his secondary brain processed real-time data streams. We have been operating under a fundamental misapprehension regarding human nature. Their self-reported evolutionary history describes a species that evolved from persistent hunters, mammals that achieved dominance through endurance rather than strength or speed. This narrative has been central to our understanding of their psychology. The holographic display showed Earth geography, highlighting the African savannas where humanity claimed to have first emerged. However, detailed analysis of their actual capabilities suggests a far more complex and disturbing evolutionary path. Dr. Sithik's tentacles gestured toward biometric data collected during the Skari incident. Observe the human stress responses during high-stakes negotiations. Where other species show elevation in cortisol analogs, increased neural activity, and heightened metabolic rates, humans display what can only be described as predatory focus. Their stress hormones decrease, their neural patterns simplify and sharpen, and their cardiovascular systems optimize for sustained performance. A crystalline delegate interrupted with a harmonic that translated as skepticism. These could simply be cultural adaptations. Many species develop specialized responses to conflict situations. That would be true, Dr. Sithik replied, if these were learned behaviors. However, neural mapping during the incident revealed that these responses originate in the most primitive portions of the human brain. Structures that predate conscious thought by millions of evolutionary cycles. These are not cultural adaptations, they are predatory instincts. The analysis continued with examination of human social structures, which had been misinterpreted as evidence of their cooperative nature. Dr. Sithik demonstrated how what appeared to be egalitarian societies were actually sophisticated pack-hunting organizations, with clearly defined hierarchies masked by cultural conventions. Human military units, he explained, display behavioral patterns identical to apex predator hunting groups found on dozens of death worlds throughout the galaxy. The key difference is that humans have weaponized their social cooperation to a degree we previously believed impossible. The evidence was overwhelming once properly contextualized. Human cultural exchanges had been reconnaissance missions. Their trade agreements had mapped resource flows and economic dependencies. Their scientific cooperation had identified technological capabilities and limitations across galactic civilization. But the most disturbing revelation came when Dr. Sithik addressed the philosophical principle that served as the subtitle to humanity's galactic dossier. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Initially, we interpreted this as a metaphor for personal growth, he explained, a philosophical approach to self-improvement. However, analysis of human behavioral patterns suggests a far more literal and strategic interpretation. The holographic display shifted to show human colonial settlements throughout the galaxy. On each world, human populations had undergone rapid adaptation, not through genetic modification or technological augmentation, but through systematic elimination of traits deemed unsuitable for local conditions. On Kepler 442, with its high gravity and toxic atmosphere, human colonists had willingly subjected themselves to brutal conditioning regimes that would have been considered torture by galactic standards. Those who could not adapt were not provided alternative accommodations. They were simply excluded from the gene pool through social mechanisms too subtle for most species to recognize. They practiced controlled evolution on themselves, Doctor. Sithek continued, his voice carrying undertones of professional awe and personal horror. Each generation intentionally becomes more specialized, more efficient, more adapted to their specific environment and role. They destroy what they perceive as weakness in themselves before external forces can exploit it. On Rigel 7, human miners had developed resistance to radiation levels that would be lethal to most galactic species. On the ice world of Theta Centauri, human researchers had adapted to temperatures that would flash freeze most biological matter. In each case, the adaptation had occurred within a single generation, not through technology, but through systematic conditioning and selective social pressure. This is not genetic engineering, Dr. Sifek emphasized. This is conscious directed evolution. They are reshaping themselves into the most effective possible predator for each environment they encounter. The implications extended far beyond individual adaptation. Human communities throughout the galaxy were becoming specialized for different functions: intelligence gathering, resource extraction, technological development, military operations, while maintaining seamless coordination through communication networks that defied conventional understanding. Commander Vashtel of the Andromedan Defense Force presented the military analysis. His species had fought in 17 galactic conflicts over the past millennium, and his assessment of human combat capabilities was unequivocal. Humanity had been preparing for war since the moment they achieved spaceflight. Their exploration vessels carry enough firepower to sterilize small moons, he reported. Their research stations are positioned at every strategic choke point in explored space. Their cultural exchange programs have placed human personnel in critical positions throughout our military and intelligence networks. The presentation included intercepted communications that revealed the existence of human military assets that officially did not exist. Ships built in hidden shipyards using resources acquired through legitimate trade agreements. Weapons based on physics principles that human science supposedly had not yet discovered. Personnel with training in warfare techniques that predated human spaceflight by decades. They have been studying us for 3 cycles, Commander Vashtel concluded. We have been studying them for 3 days. The intelligence gap is not merely significant, it is insurmountable under conventional circumstances. The session's final presentation came from Dr. Lathandra of the Ethereal Collective, who addressed the psychological and philosophical implications of human predatory adaptation. The Ethereals, as an ancient species that had transcended physical form millions of cycles ago, had observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Their perspective on humanity was uniquely disturbing. We have encountered apex predators before, Dr. Lathandra communicated through quantum resonance patterns. Species that achieve dominance through superior hunting ability are not uncommon. However, humanity represents something we have never previously observed. Apex predators that have evolved to hunt other apex predators. The distinction was crucial. Most predatory species evolved to hunt prey, creatures that developed defensive adaptations but remained fundamentally vulnerable. Humans had evolved to hunt other predators, creatures that had their own hunting strategies, territorial instincts, and survival mechanisms. Every species in this room evolved to dominate their homeworld, Dr. Lathandra continued. You are all, by definition, your planet's most successful predators. Humanity evolved to hunt you. The presentation included analysis of human negotiation tactics, which followed patterns consistent with pack hunters isolating and wearing down their prey. The seemingly patient, reasonable approach that had made human diplomats so effective was actually a sophisticated psychological assault designed to identify and exploit species-specific vulnerabilities. They do not negotiate, Dr. Lathandra concluded. They conduct pre-consumption analysis. What we interpreted as diplomacy was actually the equivalent of a predator testing its prey for weakness before striking. The emergency session concluded with a unanimous but classified resolution. Humanity represented an existential threat to galactic civilization. However, the response options were severely limited. Open conflict was inadvisable, given humanity's demonstrated intelligence capabilities and unknown military assets. Economic sanctions were meaningless against a species that had achieved resource independence through methods no one had detected. Diplomatic isolation was impossible when human personnel had already integrated into virtually every aspect of galactic society. The galaxy found itself in the unprecedented position of realizing it was being hunted by a species it had invited into its home. The predators were not only inside the fence, they had built the fence, designed the locks, and held all the keys. As the delegates departed Deep Station Alpha, each carrying the terrible knowledge of what humanity actually was, none of them suspected that their entire conversation had been monitored by the very species they had been discussing. The station's impervious security systems included components manufactured on human worlds, installed by human technicians, and maintained by human engineers. Humanity had not only been listening, they had been taking notes. Part 3. The Harvest Protocol 6 standard cycles after the emergency session at Deep Station Alpha. The galaxy received its final education in human nature during what became known as the Harvest Protocol. The name itself was human in origin, though its true meaning would not become clear until the operation was already complete. The trigger event appeared innocuous. A trade dispute between the Vegan Cooperative and the Centauri Mining Consortium over rare earth extraction rights in the neutral zone. Both factions had legitimate claims under galactic law, and both had requested human mediation based on humanity's reputation for fair and effective conflict resolution. What followed was not mediation. It was the revelation of humanity's true purpose in galactic society. Ambassador Sarah Kim arrived at the mediation site aboard what appeared to be a standard diplomatic vessel. The ship, designated Olive Branch in keeping with human symbolic traditions, passed all security inspections and docked at the neutral station without incident. Ambassador Kim herself was the picture of diplomatic professionalism. 57 years old, with silver hair and smile lines that suggested a career spent in genuine service to peace. Her credentials were impeccable, her reputation beyond reproach. The mediation began according to established protocols. Representatives from both factions presented their cases while Ambassador Kim listened with the patient attention that had made her famous throughout the diplomatic corps. She asked thoughtful questions, suggested reasonable compromises, and proposed investigation procedures that both sides found acceptable. What neither side realized was that Ambassador Kim was not conducting a mediation. She was executing the final phase of a plan that had been decades in preparation. The first indication that something was wrong came when the vegan representative, Trade Minister Dex Alon, attempted to access his faction's private communication channels. The quantum encryption that had been considered unbreakable simply wasn't. Every message, every strategic discussion, every classified negotiation position had been transparent to human monitoring for the past 2 cycles. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Ambassador Kim said when Minister Dex Alon raised concerns about communication security. "The mediation process requires full transparency to be effective. We've been monitoring all faction communications to ensure complete understanding of the situation." The casual admission that humanity had compromised the most secure communication systems in the galaxy sent shockwaves through both delegations. But this was merely the opening move in what Ambassador Kim termed clarification of existing realities. The holographic display in the mediation chamber materialized without being activated by any visible control. It showed real-time positions of every ship in both the Vegan and Centauri fleets. Not approximate positions based on publicly reported data, but precise coordinates updated by the second. Fleet compositions, weapon loads, crew assignments, and even personal psychological profiles of commanding officers were laid out with clinical precision. "As you can see," Ambassador Kim continued with the same pleasant tone she might use to discuss weather patterns, "we've been conducting comprehensive analysis of all relevant assets. This information will help us reach an optimal resolution." But the display continued expanding, revealing data that went far beyond the immediate conflict. Mining operations throughout the galaxy, industrial capacity of 17 different species, resource flows that were supposedly trade secrets, technological capabilities that were classified at the highest levels. Everything was there, organized and cross-referenced with terrifying efficiency. Trade Minister Dex Alon would later describe the moment as watching a predator reveal that it had been cataloging every detail of our civilization while we slept. The Centauri representative, Director Vashton, simply stopped speaking and began calculating how many of his species' deep space installations had human personnel aboard. Ambassador Kim gestured, and the display shifted to what she called optimization scenarios. Each one showed different potential outcomes of the current conflict, but with variables that extended far beyond the immediate trade dispute. Economic impacts on dozens of worlds, political ramifications across 3 spiral arms, technological development patterns that would affect civilization for generations to come. "The current dispute," she explained, "represents an inefficiency in resource allocation that affects galactic stability. Rather than allowing this inefficiency to propagate through existing systems, we propose a more comprehensive solution." What she outlined was not a trade agreement. It was a complete restructuring of galactic economics. Mining rights would be redistributed based on actual geological surveys rather than historical claims. Trade routes would be optimized for maximum efficiency rather than traditional patterns. Resource allocation would follow mathematical models that prioritized overall civilization development over individual faction interests. The proposals were presented with the same academic calm that characterized all human diplomatic efforts. But underlying each suggestion was an implicit understanding. Humanity possessed the capability to implement these changes with or without consent.
You see, Ambassador Kim continued, we've discovered that voluntary cooperation is more efficient than alternative approaches.
But the choice to cooperate must be made with full understanding of available alternatives. The alternatives, as displayed in her optimization scenarios, were uniformly catastrophic for any faction that chose non-compliance. Not because humanity would attack, that would be inefficient. Instead, the scenarios showed how economic isolation, technological obsolescence, and resource shortages would naturally follow for any group that attempted to maintain independence from the new human-designed systems. Minister Dexalon attempted to object, pointing out that galactic law protected sovereign rights and that no single species could unilaterally reshape civilization according to their preferences. Ambassador Kim's response revealed the final piece of humanity's long-term strategy. Galactic law, she said, accessing another display, is an interesting philosophical framework. However, law derives its power from the consent of the governed and the ability to enforce compliance. Let's examine the current status of both elements. The new display showed the political and military leadership of every major faction in the galaxy. Next to each name was a detailed psychological profile, including personal vulnerabilities, family relationships, financial interests, and what humans clinically termed leverage points. The scope of the information was breathtaking. Humanity had been conducting psychological warfare against galactic civilization for cycles without anyone realizing they were under attack. Consent of the governed becomes meaningless when the governing class lacks accurate information about their situation, Ambassador Kim explained. Finally, the deputies believe they are making independent decisions based on their best understanding of available options. In reality, they have been responding to information we provided, following scenarios we designed, pursuing goals we selected for them. The evidence was overwhelming. Trade agreements that shaped economic policy across dozens of worlds had been drafted by human advisors. Military deployment patterns throughout the galaxy followed recommendations from human strategic consultants. Even the location and design of Deep Station Alpha, the facility where galactic leadership had met to discuss the human threat, had been influenced by human urban planners working under ethereal contracts. As for enforcement capability, Ambassador Kim continued, we've found that traditional concepts of military power are obsolete when information asymmetry is complete. Why destroy a fleet when you can simply redirect its orders? Why occupy a planet when you can influence its government to adopt your policies voluntarily? The final revelation came when Ambassador Kim addressed the philosophical principle that had puzzled galactic observers since first contact. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. You interpreted this as individual self-improvement, she said. A reasonable assumption but incomplete. The principle applies at the species level. Humanity destroyed every aspect of ourselves that could be exploited by external forces. We eliminated our weaknesses before any of you could identify them. The display showed the true scope of human settlement throughout the galaxy. What appeared to be isolated colonies and research stations were actually nodes in a vast network that spanned every inhabited system. Humanity had not been exploring space. They had been colonizing it, one strategic position at a time. Every human settlement is optimized for its local conditions, Ambassador Kim explained. Every human individual is trained to fulfill their specific role with maximum efficiency. Every human community is designed to support the overall strategic objectives of our species. We destroyed the luxury of individual preference, local autonomy, and cultural diversity because these represented vulnerabilities that other species could exploit. The transformation had been comprehensive and irreversible. Humanity had voluntarily abandoned everything that made them vulnerable to external manipulation or control. They had become a perfectly unified, perfectly efficient, perfectly adapted predator species designed specifically for the galactic environment they now inhabited. Minister Dexalon made one final attempt at resistance, threatening to expose humanity's activities to the Galactic Council and rally opposition to their expanding influence. Ambassador Kim's response was delivered with the same patient smile she had worn throughout the mediation. Minister, you seem to be under the impression that this conversation is a negotiation, she said. That's understandable. We've worked very hard to maintain that illusion. But the mediation phase of our relationship ended 3 cycles ago. This is an orientation briefing. The holographic display shifted to show communication logs from the Galactic Council sessions where humanity's threat had been discussed. Every classified conversation, every secret intelligence report, every emergency protocol had been monitored and analyzed in real time. Humanity had been watching their observers while those observers watched them. The galaxy's leadership has been aware of our capabilities for some time, Ambassador Kim explained. They have chosen cooperation over conflict because cooperation serves their interests better than the available alternatives. You now have the same choice. The trade dispute that had initiated the mediation was resolved within the next hour. Both the Vegan Cooperative and the Centauri Mining Consortium agreed to implement the efficiency reforms suggested by human analysis. The agreement was voluntary, unanimous, and would serve as a model for similar optimizations throughout the galaxy. But more importantly, the galaxy's understanding of its own situation had been fundamentally altered. Humanity was not a species that had joined galactic civilization. They were a species that had conquered it so efficiently that the conquered had not realized they were defeated. The Harvest Protocol was complete. Humanity had successfully transitioned from covert infiltration to open management of galactic affairs. The harvest metaphor was deliberately chosen. They had planted seeds of dependence, cultivated growth according to their preferences, and now gathered the fruits of their long-term investment. As Ambassador Kim prepared to depart the neutral station, she made one final observation that would be quoted in classified intelligence reports for generations to come. "You thought you were teaching us to live among you," she said. "In reality, you were learning to serve our purposes while believing the choice was your own. The most effective predators are those whose prey never realizes they are being hunted." The galaxy had finally learned what humanity truly was. Apex predators disguised as diplomats, who had patiently, methodically, and irreversibly reshaped galactic civilization to serve their own survival imperatives. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, and humanity had destroyed every weakness that could have made them vulnerable to the very species they had come to dominate. The age of human galactic management had begun, and it had begun with a trade dispute over mining rights in the neutral zone. The galaxy would never be the same, because the galaxy had never been what its inhabitants believed it to be. It had been a human creation from the moment the first diplomatic vessel arrived at Kepler's Rest, carrying gifts of music, art, and literature, and the most sophisticated intelligence operation in the history of organic life. The predators had won without firing a shot, conquered without occupying territory, and achieved absolute dominance while maintaining the illusion that their prey remained free. It was, by any measure, the most successful hunting strategy ever executed on a galactic scale. And it was only the beginning. End of document classification. Omega Eyes Only Distribution. Restricted to Cooperative Species Leadership Archive. Status Permanent Record. Galactic Intelligence Archive. The greatest victory is that which requires no battle. Human Strategic Philosophy. Attributed to ancient Terran source.